Hi and welcome to the first Making the Media podcast episode for 2025. I'm your host Craig Wilson, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the team to welcome back our previous listeners and subscribers and to welcome anyone new joining us for the first time. It's great to have you with us. Attracting audiences is one of the major challenges facing news organisations these days, and on the podcast we've talked before about issues such as news avoidance and the need to tailor stories and coverage to new platforms. One of those platforms is TikTok, which when it launched was probably not really regarded as a place for serious news. But in recent years it has grown massively and is now a very active place for news organisations seeking all-important eyeballs. CBC in Canada launched on TikTok back in 2022 and since then has seen dramatic growth in audiences on the platform, reaching more than 1 million subscribers towards the end of last year. So let's dig in and find out why the platform is important to them, but also on topics such as the changing nature of storytelling, the methods of delivering vertical video, conversational news, trust and transparency. Our guest for the episode is Irene Thomaidis, who is the acting managing editor of digital publishing for CBC. With a long career in journalism specialising in the digital space, I began by asking her about the decision to test out TikTok for CBC.
We had our eye on it long before we were on it. Probably the first big news organization to get on TikTok would have been Washington Post. And they got on, I want to say in the spring of 2019. And we kept our eye on it. It was a challenge because telling stories with a 30-second cap, which is I think is what it was at the time for TikTok, is tricky. But we have balance to consider, context to consider, legal consideration sometimes, and we didn't want to copy what the Washington Post was, which was basically at the time based around one personality and slightly different than what we had been doing on our socials to date. So we kept our eye on it, and as TikTok increased the sort of time limits, I think we're up to 10 minutes now, our interest grew. And in general, TikTok or not, our interest was also growing in producing vertical video, which makes sense. It's delivery from mobile audience. So around the spring of 2022, we really got serious about it. And we said, okay, what would it look like? What would it be? Who would we be on TikTok now that we think we can enter this space? Other reasons that we were talking about, by the way, of entering this space over the time is we kept our eye on it. Definitely a younger audience. We are interested in attracting a younger audience. Definitely a lot of misinformation on that platform. And you kind of want to address it on a platform where people are going. And then when COVID hit, people started joining in the tens of millions per month. There was this massive increase of young people there. And so we just couldn't deny that this was a place where people were getting information, sometimes misinformation, and we wanted to be there. So then, next step, we went to what would we look like on that platform? What would it look like? And one things we pride ourselves on at CBC News is we have this really robust team that looks at that does audience listening. We like to see what the audience is talking about, and we like to answer their questions. And we thought, wow, what a great opportunity to do that for young people. So we pitched it, just a single producer to sort of look into it and start the work there. And we were really into talking about our thing there is you ask, we answer. So we wanted to know what was on their minds and what we could feed back to them. And that was sort of our framing of how we launched it. And so we launched it in the fall of 2022. I think what originally brought you to me is that in the last month in December of 2024, we hit over 1 million subs. So that's been quite a bit of growth during that time. So you can imagine we're proud of the success of the channel over that time. And we've been able to really hit that younger audience that we want to get to CBC. There's often a talk between owned and operated and third-party platforms on and why we're there. And can we convert people to own and operated. And that's lovely and great if we can. But really, why we're there is we're fishing where the fish are. We are where the young people are. We're getting brand recognition. We're teaching them about like media literacy, what we do, what strong journalism does. Um, we've done stories, that sort of lift the veil on journalism and bring people in. So we think that, you know, if people are understanding what that is from a young age, they'll stay with us throughout.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I was going to ask around, and it's interesting you mentioned there about the difference between your own owned and operated properties and
Yeah.
then the social media platforms, and that's a cross pollination between the two of them. What is it about the platform you think is important for CBC in terms of the audience it's reaching?
Yeah, 100%. We know that's where a younger audience is at. That's really what's important about it. It would be ideal if we could transfer those people over to owned and operated, but we know that's not necessarily how they're consuming news. And so it's really ideal to get stories that are important out to this audience, in a way, and I think we'll get to this later, but in a way that is authentic, true to the platform, um, and trustworthy. Um, I think we've talked about this in the past, but there a lot of third-party platforms do various things to sort of combat misinfo, and TikTok really doesn't do much at all. And so it's great to sort of address it on the platform where people might be consuming it. Um, that's just one small aspect of why we're there, but that's, one of the factors.
Yeah, we'll come on to talk about that in a second. But before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about the team that you have working on it. You talked about the growth of the digital team, but
Yeah,
specifically for the team here, one of the things that I feel is important is that people have to understand how TikTok works in
that's right.
order for it then for you to then fully utilize it, which I think is different from the approach that people have perhaps taken in the past about do we need to tailor content specifically? But I think for TikTok in particular, is it important for you that you have a team that's very well versed in that medium, if you like?
1,000%. You have to live on the platform, right? You would never produce a show for TV that you weren't watching or you weren't familiar with. Why would you go to a platform where you're not very familiar with it? So, this team, they repurpose content from throughout CBC, but they also pitch original content, and they're sort of aware of what the conversation is like in that space. Um, we started with, and we still have sort of one main TikTok producer, Ashley Frazier, who does a fantastic job. But the rest of the social team started to pivot definitely more into the vertical video space. One, because that's where the audience was, and two, because in Canada, news, there was a ban on news with meta properties, right? And so we were no longer on Facebook, we were no longer on Instagram. We had those resources. Where were we gonna go? This was a natural spot for us, and we can repurpose that vertical video on owned and operated. We can repurpose it now on YouTube Shorts. There are spots and within CBC that aren't solely news where we can repurpose video, vertical video on Reels. So it isn't just about TikTok as a platform, but about that format. Whatever happens with TikTok in the future, that format isn't going away. And so, and that storytelling doesn't leave. The way the edits are, the way that the delivery is, it's not um, entirely traditional. And so that's why we've sort of built up a roster of producers who can feed into and help guide other journalists within the CBC who present on the platform.
Yeah, what I was going to ask there is about how the team works with the wider organization because CDC is a large organization, it has many different offices, it had lots of different outlets. So how does it work in terms of say your news gathering or your coordination between the TikTok team and the wider team?
Yeah. So some things are repurposed that exist already. If it makes sense to live on a social platform, it's already sort of sometimes it's a moment that we might have gathered that just really makes sense to get there. And then some stuff is produced TikTok first in mind. But we're telling the story in a slightly different way, maybe taking a slightly different in or angle. So we work with our flagship news program, The National, about that, which is a show of ours that's an explainer, investigative, at the state marketplace. We have dozens of reporters across Canada. Each region can have its own TikTok account that we work with to help either develop them on their platform or sort of do a co-production between us. But ultimately, we find the people who sort of created the stories are often the best people to tell the stories or retell the stories. So we like to do that. And there is a certain authenticity to that on TikTok. People are always like, oh, you need, an exclusively young hosting cast, you need, um, you know, um, but what we really lean on is what we want is authenticity. And so if that associate producer who worked on an investigation for a year, we want to talk to that person and get that person's take. And should the feel be right, they're the ones who actually deliver it at the end of the day. So you'll see our host Ashley and a roster of our social producers fronting these, but you'll also see um, from time to time the journalists who worked on the stories fronting them as well. There's just so much we can pull from. Like it is almost it is to narrow it down, but we've never got a lack of content that we think that will do well on a platform.
Is it also the case that you see it as an opportunity almost to give us a behind the scenes look at how
Yeah,
stories are created and produced? Because when I worked in television news, which was a little time ago now, it was very much seen as a one-way, almost like a monologue. Where I
sure.
think news has changed so much now that it's much more about a conversation. It's much more about that explanation and trying to be authentic on the platform. So is it a case of of trying to say to people, okay, here is the story, but also here's a bit of background to the story that you might not see on other platforms? Is that part of the approach as well?
Yeah, Craig, you hit the nail on the head. It is called social for a reason. It is a two-way conversation. We often talk about telling the story with someone, learning with someone, taking them on our learning journey, as opposed to just speaking to someone. So it is 100% that. That's how it's delivered. You'll often hear stuff like, "Oh, maybe we started the story on this end, but to do story A, and then story B caught our eye, and we went over here." And so just lifting the veil on that helps build trust with our audience. So when we're transparent about how we got our stories, um, it takes away the mystery. There was a long period on social where the thinking was no one's interested in how we do it. They're just interested in the final product. And then there was like a 180. And people really are interested in how we do it and how we got where we got because I think that there is a big mistrust of media and of media sources. So the more we can bring them along the journey, the more transparent we can be, the easier it will be to build trust with that audience.
One of the things about digital platforms as well is the kind of analytics that you can get, which is very different from, I'm going to look at the overnight ratings and I'll be trying to discern from that, why this particular show was successful or otherwise. So what about analytics and how do you use them in that sort of editorial decision-making process?
So not the only thing, but it is definitely included in the process. We know, for instance, moments, those sort of you know, holy crap moments, do well, and we'll always shoot through on analytics. But we want to build deeper into that. So sometimes we go into those big stories and we're like, what is the audience talking about though? What are they asking? What do they want to know more about? And then we use that to build out our next piece. So we're definitely interested when there's interest in the story, but it's that angle in like what's next. You've got this 2 million viewed TikTok. What does the audience want next? And that will still bring hundreds of thousands of viewers who are interested in that story beyond that holy crap moment that I was referring to. But it is definitely we know we're attracting that younger audience, and we look to see what they're interested in. Those analytics don't just feed what we do on TikTok, but what they feed what we do within the service. So we can go back and say, hey, X TV show, hey, X program, this story took off on TikTok today. Young people are interested in it. We should dig into it elsewhere too. So it's not just a matter of feeding how we pick what goes on TikTok, but it's what's being delivered to our audience overall.
And what do you think it says about the two things I want to ask around? One is around the evolution of storytelling, because I think that's a really interesting aspect of A, what a story is, and B, how the story is told. And then the other side to that is how that then works in terms of making sure the content that you produce is seen as authentic on that platform.
Right. So storytelling um, on on TikTok, it is a different sort of edit, a different in. You all often come with the gold off the hop. Very traditional storytelling. You could lead in with like, oh, on a quiet feline street in this neighborhood, such and such happened. Then you get to TikTok, and it's like the moment off the hop, and someone's saying, "Hey, what happened there? Let's talk about that. Let's dig into that." So we always talk like you got to draw the audience in right away, but it's more than that now. I think we're finding more and more people aren't only tuning in for 3 seconds or 10 seconds or 12 seconds, which was the beginning of social. They want to learn more and they want to dive a little bit deeper. But um, the way we're telling the stories is at a different pace. It's often quicker. It's often using visual prompts. So, you'll see people say, "Hey, what about this and that?" And then like graphics pop in to show what you're talking about, which is not necessarily traditional news storytelling. There are jump cuts, stuff that you never really used to do in the past that is authentic to the platform because that's how people are editing on that platform in other circumstances, non-news stories or telling their own stories. So, in terms of how the story is told, it's the same story, just with different techniques to get behind it. The journalism, doesn't go out the window. There isn't, some sort of different standard on TikTok. We hold them to their same journalistic standards, but the way in which it's told might be a bit different. And it's just true and authentic to the platform. Um, all sorts of socials will say, "Hey, talk, ask us in the comments and do that kind of thing." That's because it's that two-way conversation that we were talking about a little earlier. And you won't get that in traditional TV really because you can't do that on TV. So the techniques are different, but the storytelling is the same. I do think though, if I was to guess about the future, you'll see more of these techniques go into more traditional outlets, because, people have an appetite for them. They're accustomed to them. What comes out on TikTok might come out on Instagram 2 weeks later, and, you might start seeing on TV in that same format. We have delivered, it's not necessarily optimized for TV, but we had delivered vertical, videos on TV. Anytime we're telling a news story and there's, user-generated content, it's often shot in that format and shown on TV, and the audience isn't saying, "Well, wait, this isn't horizontal, we won't watch it," It's just, uh, they're already accustomed to this, and know that that's standard practice, so it's not turning them off in any way.
You said something that really interesting there that I wanted to pick up on because, and I've spoken to other people who work in this sort of digital realm about this, that what you're doing is creating content, but what you're not doing is dumbing down or talking down to the audience. It is so important that you give the audience the credence that they can understand this. And this isn't about simplifying or shying away from complex stories. Is that a fair assessment of what you're trying to do?
That is, 100% a fair assessment, 1,000% a fair assessment. You're coming in with an angle that will attract them maybe a little bit more into the story, but it is not at all dumbing it down. And again, like, for us specifically, when we have this "you ask, we answer" format, if, you ask this question, we wonder the same thing too. Those questions that are coming up are questions that don't necessarily aren't exclusive to that demo, right? We know that there's a news avoidance in all age groups. We hear about this all the time, and it's been growing over the years. And we want to bring people back in, but in a way that is accessible to them, and a way that is welcoming to them. And so I don't think it's welcoming to be this like voice of authority sort of talking down, but again, going on this learning journey with them and saying, "Hey, yeah, we're also interested in that. And did you know this? And how about that?" And things that think make you think, but in a way, it's not dumbed down. It's just more accessible.
And then you have obviously examples where you have breaking news. And I guess in the case of breaking news, you're about getting the news out there to start with, even if that's perhaps something that you wouldn't necessarily think is a subject for TikTok. Obviously in Canada at the moment, you have the
Yeah.
change of prime minister that's going to happen fairly soon. So that announcement comes out. So how do you deal with something like that? Because obviously the wider CBC organization is really interested in lots and lots of different angles on that particular story.
Well, that's the holy crap moment, and that goes across all age groups, right? Like, I think we need to give the younger age group a lot more credit than we do. For a long time, the social battle was like, "Oh, I've got this quirky video, that's for social," or, "Oh, I've got this cute video, that's for social," and there wasn't an understanding, I don't think, that the younger audience is also interested, in news and what's going on in the world, but again, want it in a way that's, um that they're accustomed to hearing it, or they're accustomed to getting their information. So that's the only change really that's different. But we do take those moments. They're sometimes not, made specifically for TikTok, but those sort of tentpole moments that we know is going to attract the audience of all ages, and we just cut it and we put it in, and then from there we start looking at the questions. What are they asking? What's next for the government? How long will this process take? What happens in the meantime? You know, all of those questions are being asked, and like I said, we hear them, and we know that they're not limited to this, younger audience. We know that's not the case, so we take them and we use it to feed our journalism across the board, but particularly returning it back on TikTok. It is, not uncommon for us, and it's not uncommon on TikTok to take one of those comments and do a new sort of story, and thread out of it, and that's what we do. So part of what we do, is based on the tools in the platform, and another part is sort of, bringing a CBC look to it. So not all of our graphics are in platform, they could be, but we do want people to have we do want that brand recognition, right? So can we do it similar to TikTok, but in CBC colors? Can we do it similar to TikTok, but in a CBC font? Something that sort of just says, "Oh, I recognize this stands out from the pack," but it's not unfamiliar to the platform itself. It's a natural merge, and it wasn't as hard as we thought, to get. It took a lot of work for sure, but it wasn't as hard as we thought to get there. So we want people to recognize, our name and associate it with the trust that we build in a platform where, anyone can post. Some others are trustworthy, and some are not. There are good actors, there are bad actors. There's all of that, but we really want to develop, our audience's critical thinking skills and an appreciation of the work that we do. Um, we've done stories where we talk about how, at the CBC, um, our rules include firsthand identification of sources or double sourcing and the value that that brings to a story. And it's fed in, um, not as a lecture, but in a way, again, it's more transparent. Like, this is how we got this story. And this is the stuff we do to get the story. And we see it in the comments automatically. There's a definite appreciation for seeing the behind the scenes and seeing what makes a true story versus what does.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think at a time when you said it there yourself, like a lot of people are looking at news now. They perhaps don't even recognize that it is news because they're getting it from different sources and different
That's
platforms.
right.
And then there's also news, it can be seen as coming from anybody. It doesn't necessarily need to be seen from coming from, the main presenter on the National or the main presenter of the 1 o'clock news or whoever. Influencers are having an influence on that as well, and I think that muddies the waters for news organizations, traditionally to come forward with it. So I think that's really interesting that the whole approach that you've taken around trust and transparency, because I think that is becoming a bigger issue in order to ensure that audiences are better informed.
Yeah, I'm not saying that all influencers are not trustworthy, but we know we have a set. Some are, some aren't. Right? It is what it is. But we have a set standard, and we want the audience to know that this is a standard that we have when we're like you can go into a story and see that it was done by CBC News and know that it sort of has these journalistic standards and have faith in that. And sometimes, it's more than just having faith in it. We'll walk you through the process. We'll say, "Hey, this is what we did at this point. This is how we verified this." bit of information here. We heard this from, 2 sources. Analysis led us to this. We heard from this person, and the balance to that comment or the context around that comment you should really know about, because sometimes those big moments that go wild need the context, right? And so that's what we're here to deliver. Here's the context around that story that you might not have known about, that, well, that got 2 million views. Did you know this other piece of information is needed to understand where that came from? And again, the audience respond. They share, they comment, they they respond themselves. And we're seeing that value. Like, we're seeing it time and time again, actually. Um, so, there will always be people who have a mistrust of media, and we'll comment on that. But we welcome that. And we always say, okay, well, let's dig into that. Where do you think that mistrust comes from? Let's take you down the path. And so we're not going to convince everyone at the end of the day, but we think reasonably minded people, we will. And again, it's getting them to think critically about what they're seeing. The value in that is tenfold.
So you've seen, some major growth in a relatively short space of time, to get over to 1 million subscriptions, which is amazing. So what do you think is the future for CBC and TikTok? Or I guess wider with just digital platforms?
Social has certainly disrupted this space quite a bit, the news space quite a bit. I don't think we're going to stop wanting to be where our audience is at. We talked a little bit about owned and operated earlier. We want to. It's not either or, and I think that for a long time was where people were thinking like, oh, if we're on this space, we can't be on this space. If we're on this space, we can't be on that space. They feed into each other, and so I don't think we're leaving third party platforms, not just TikTok. I'm talking YouTube too. Should Meta become a thing for news producers in Canada? Again, I think we'd probably want to join that space again. But I think we'll continue to look at the analytics, and we'll continue to look at the value of what we get out of things. What's the value of the conversation in those spaces? Um, has that declined? Is that on the incline? Are we still seeing the same sort of interest in it here? What's the value of the reach of the audience? What's that age of the audience? I don't think that TikTok is the forever only social media where young people are going to go, but can we keep in those spaces? And again, that storytelling, while we know it came from TikTok, isn't only going to be in that space. If you go to cbc.ca, we recently launched, CBC Shorts, all vertical video telling in that space, optimized for a mobile phone. So I can't necessarily speak to the future of TikTok. There's lots at play there, as you know, but I can speak to the value of this type of storytelling and being in those spots. There's a reason why every other social platform in the world has a similar answer to relatively short to mid vertical video. It's because that the audience is there for it and they want it.
Irene, it's been fantastic to talk to you and to delve into this. It's a really interesting subject, I think, for our audience. That's been terrific. But I think, as you know, there is one question I've asked everyone who's been on the podcast, so I'm going to ask you as well, which is, what is it, if anything, that keeps you up at night?
Hands down, it's artificial intelligence. We talk about and what's being produced on these platforms and how it's being sold. Um, those critical thinking skills that we talk about developing in young people and older people, for all people, are really going to be tested as AI gets better and more realistic. And so, how we can continue to show people what is real and trustworthy versus not, that's what keeps me up at night.
Thanks a lot to Irene for sharing her views, not just on AI, but also on the whole subject of digital news. CBC also recently passed 1 billion streams on their YouTube channels, so they're clearly doing something which is working for them in that space. The way in which news coverage is coordinated these days is of critical importance, of course, so if you want to find out more about Avid's recent acquisition of WolfTech and how it's helping shape that conversation, then check out the show notes. There you can also find links to another podcast episode with CBC, plus more information on how others approach the subject of digital distribution, and of course please check out all of the Avid social channels, including TikTok. That's all for this episode. Thanks to Irene, thanks to our producer Matt Diggs, and most of all, thanks to you for listening. Join us next time for more on the inside track from the people making the media.